A black woman quietly boards her flight, blending into the crowd, dressed simply. Nothing flashy, just another passenger trying to get home. The flight attendant barely glances at her, speaking with clipped, dismissive words. She's treated like an inconvenience, not a customer. What the flight attendant doesn't know: this woman is the wife of the CEO of the airline she works for. What happens next flips the script entirely, sparking a chain of events that leaves the entire crew stunned and serves as a powerful reminder that respect should never be selective. Stay tuned, this is a story that will make you think twice about the assumptions we make every day. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this hits home. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that reveal the unexpected. The plane hummed softly, a low vibration that settled into the bones. A sound so steady it almost disappeared beneath the quiet rustle of magazines and the soft murmur of conversation. Amara Delaney sat by the window, the sky stretching endlessly beyond the glass. There was something comforting about the stillness of flight, the way the world below seemed to pause, to hold its breath, as if for those few hours, the demands of living could be put aside. But even up here, far above the cities and towns that marked the geography of her life, Amara knew the weight of the world's gaze could not be left behind. The flight attendant approached, moving down the aisle with the precise efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to count. Natalie Harper's uniform was immaculate, the navy blue fabric pressed to perfection, her hair pulled back in a way that left nothing out of place. She was the kind of woman who commanded spaces not by force, but by an air of quiet authority that rarely welcomed challenge. As Natalie neared Amara's row, her eyes skimmed over the passengers with a glance that was quick but practiced. When her gaze landed on Amara, it lingered just a second too long. It wasn't an obvious thing, not the sort of stare that drew attention, but Amara felt it nonetheless. That pause, that flicker of hesitation, she had encountered it before. In stores, in lobbies, in restaurants. "Seatbelt signs on, ma'am," Natalie said, her voice clipped, polite but distant. Amara glanced down at her lap. Her belt already buckled. "It's already fastened," she replied softly, offering the faintest of smiles. Natalie's eyes narrowed, as if she hadn't heard. "You should have done that earlier," she added, the same even tone, but with an edge sharp enough to catch. For a moment, neither of them moved. There was no outburst, no confrontation. Amara had long learned the art of letting moments like these pass. It was easier, sometimes, to swallow the bitterness, to let it dissolve quietly beneath the surface. She gave a small nod and turned back toward the window, allowing Natalie to move on as if nothing had happened. But the weight lingered. It wasn't the words, not really. It was the unspoken thing beneath them, the ease with which Natalie had made an assumption, the quiet dismissal in her tone. Amara had felt it countless times before. That subtle shift in posture, the way people grew just a little stiffer, as if bracing for something unseen. To the other passengers, it was nothing, just a flight attendant doing her job. But for Amara, it was another reminder that there were places she could not move through unseen, no matter how quietly she carried herself. She thought of Charles, of the conversations they'd had over the years, how he had told her to let these moments roll off her back, how he sometimes grew frustrated at the things she refused to name outright. "You can't let every slight stick to you," he'd say. And he was right, of course. But Charles didn't know what it meant to feel that weight. Not really. As the flight settled into its rhythm, Amara closed her eyes, letting the soft hum of the plane carry her thoughts elsewhere. But just as she began to drift, a voice a little too loud cut through the quiet. "Excuse me." A man 2 rows ahead was waving Natalie down. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted. Everything about him screamed importance. The kind of man who expected the world to bend toward him without question. Natalie appeared at his side in an instant, her voice softening as she leaned in to listen. Amara watched, unseen, as Natalie's posture shifted, as the lines on her face eased into something warmer. The man smiled, laughing at something Natalie had said. And she laughed too, a light, practiced sound. Amara turned back to the window, her reflection faint in the glass. It wasn't that she wanted special attention, nor did she crave confrontation. But there was something about the ease of that exchange that sat heavy in her chest. How quickly the world could soften for some and harden for others. She thought again of Charles, of the life they had built together. the quiet power that came with his name. And yet, even as the wife of one of the most influential men in the airline industry, there were moments like this, moments that reminded her power did not always translate into protection. The plane moved steadily through the sky, but Amara's thoughts remained grounded, circling the memory of Natalie's glance, the weight of her voice. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Amara had long learned that small things had a way of growing. And this time, she wasn't sure she wanted to let it pass. The hum of the engines faded into the background, but inside Amara, the quiet deepened. It was a silence she recognized, the kind that stretched across generations, across lives lived under the watchful eyes of people who never truly saw you. The plane continued its smooth ascent, but Amara's thoughts stayed grounded. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the other passengers, the elderly couple 2 rows ahead, the young professional typing furiously on his laptop, the teenager with oversized headphones nodding absently to music. They all moved through the world as if it belonged to them, unaware of the intricate dance others had to perform just to exist quietly within it. Amara's eyes drifted to Natalie Harper as she moved from row to row, dispensing drinks and carefully rehearsed smiles. The moment between them had passed, but Amara could still feel its weight pressing against her chest like the faint imprint of a hand. Natalie's gaze skimmed over the cabin without resting too long on anyone except for a well-dressed woman a few rows up, clutching a designer handbag in her lap. When Natalie reached her, the difference was subtle but undeniable. Her smile lingered longer, her voice dipped into something warmer, as if she recognized someone who deserved more than the bare minimum. Amara turned her head toward the window, her reflection faint in the glass. This was how it happened. No grand gestures, no explicit words, just the gentle accumulation of small dismissals, so soft, so delicate, that they could almost be mistaken for nothing at all. But Amara had lived long enough to know better. The world did not need to shout to remind you where you stood. Sometimes, it only needed to whisper. A soft clinking broke the quiet as Natalie returned, maneuvering the beverage cart down the aisle. She stopped at Amara's row, her expression smoothing into polite indifference. "Would you like something to drink?" Natalie asked, not bothering to meet Amara's eye. Amara hesitated. She considered refusing, letting the moment pass without acknowledgement. But then she thought of her mother, how she used to say, "If you keep swallowing stones, one day they'll sink you." "I'll take tea," Amara replied, her voice even. Natalie poured with careful precision, but something about her movements felt colder now, as if some unseen line had been crossed. As Amara took the cup, their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. It was not the touch that lingered, but the fleeting expression that flickered across Natalie's face, something like annoyance, perhaps, or impatience. "Thank you," Amara said quietly, but Natalie was already moving down the aisle. Amara's grip tightened around the paper cup. The warmth from the tea seeped into her palm, but it did little to dispel the chill settling into her chest. Later, as the plane dipped below the clouds, preparing for descent, the cabin buzzed with the familiar rustle of passengers gathering their belongings, adjusting their seats. Amara watched as Natalie assisted an older man struggling to store his carry-on bag. She was patient, attentive, but when Natalie passed by Amara's row once more, her eyes never lifted. Amara felt invisible in a way that was far too familiar. For a long time, she had accepted this particular brand of erasure, convinced it was easier not to see the knife if it never drew blood. But she was older now, and the weight of all those years had settled differently in her bones. As the wheels touched down with a soft thud, Amara's decision crystallized. She would not leave this plane without saying something. When the aisle cleared and the passengers began their orderly procession toward the exit, Amara stayed seated, her bag resting on her lap. Natalie stood at the front, her hands clasped neatly in front of her, her smile reserved for those she deemed worthy of receiving it. Amara rose, her steps quiet but deliberate. When she reached Natalie, she paused, her eyes calm but unwavering. "Excuse me," Amara said softly, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. Natalie looked up, momentarily surprised by the interruption. "I wanted to say something," Amara continued. "Your tone earlier, it was unnecessary." Natalie blinked, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry if you felt that way," she replied, her words measured but hollow. Amara held her gaze, allowing the silence between them to stretch. It's not about how I felt, Amara said gently, but firmly. It's about how easily you made that assumption. I've done nothing to deserve less than kindness. Natalie's mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but she hesitated. For the first time, Amara saw a crack in the veneer. I hope, Amara added, her voice softening just enough. You'll think about that the next time someone like me sits in one of your rows. Natalie lowered her gaze, the tension in her shoulders betraying a flicker of discomfort. Amara didn't wait for a reply. She stepped forward, walking calmly into the jet bridge, leaving the weight of her words behind her. As she moved through the terminal, the lingering echoes of the exchange followed her. But so did something else, something quieter, steadier. Her mother's voice, rising up like an old hymn. You don't swallow every stone. Amara stepped off the plane and into the crowded terminal. The fluorescent lights overhead casting a sterile glow over the river of people flowing steadily through the gate. She walked slowly, her bag slung over her shoulder, her feet moving with the calm precision of someone who had been here before. And she had countless times. Airports were the great equalizer, or so people liked to say. But Amara had long understood the lie in that sentiment. A ticket might buy you a seat, but it didn't guarantee you the same journey. As she made her way toward the exit, she felt the weight of Natalie Harper's gaze still lingering in the back of her mind. Like the faint trace of a fingerprint left on glass. Amara didn't want to carry it with her. But the thing about moments like that was how they clung, how they seemed to slip into the folds of your skin, waiting for the next encounter to press them further inward. She found herself at the baggage claim, standing in a loose cluster of passengers, watching the conveyor belt creak to life. The crowd shifted, everyone inching closer to the edge, as if proximity might somehow make their luggage appear faster. A sharp whistle cut through the air. Hey, careful with that. Amara's eyes followed the sound, landing on a young black man in a red uniform, wrestling with a large suitcase near the back of the belt. The whistle had come from a middle-aged white man standing nearby. His face twisted in irritation. That's fragile, the man barked, pointing aggressively at the suitcase. You planning to break everything in there or just half of it? The worker straightened, his expression carefully neutral, but Amara recognized the stiffness in his shoulders. Sorry, sir, I'll handle it carefully, the young man said, lifting the suitcase with deliberate care. The white man grunted, shaking his head. I swear, no one takes pride in their work anymore, he muttered, loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. Amara felt the flicker of something cold settle beneath her ribs. She wanted to step forward, to say something, anything, but the moment passed before she could speak, swallowed by the noise of rolling luggage and the low hum of overhead announcements. The young worker moved on, his head slightly bowed, the suitcase now cradled in his arms like something precious. Amara exhaled slowly, turning back to the conveyor belt. She didn't know what unsettled her more, the man's words, or the way the crowd around them carried on as if nothing had happened. Because for them, nothing had. By the time Amara left the terminal, the sky had darkened, the parking lot aglow with the shimmer of headlights. Charles was waiting by the curb, his sleek black car idling as he leaned against the hood, hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. He smiled when he saw her, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity, maybe concern. How was the flight? He asked, opening the door for her. Amara slid into the passenger seat, letting the door close with a soft thud before answering. Uneventful, she said. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. Charles eased into the driver's seat, his hands light on the wheel as they pulled away from the airport. The city stretched out before them, a landscape of lights and shadows. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was familiar, the kind that came after years of knowing when to press and when to let things lie. But Charles wasn't one to let silence linger too long. I know that look, he said finally, glancing at her. Something happened. Amara hesitated, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Nothing big, she replied, just the usual. Charles didn't need her to explain. He understood the shorthand, the unspoken language of their shared life. The usual was an old friend, a persistent one. His fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. You want me to call someone? He asked, his tone casual, but Amara could hear the edge beneath it, the quiet fire that had kept him at the top of an industry that rarely made space for men who looked like him. She smiled softly, shaking her head. No, It's not worth the trouble. Charles didn't argue, but she saw the way his jaw shifted. The way his eyes narrowed slightly as if weighing whether to press the issue. Instead, he reached for her hand, his thumb grazing gently over her knuckles. "You know I can, though," he said quietly. Amara nodded, her fingers curling around his. "I know." The next morning, Charles left early for a meeting downtown. But Amara lingered at home, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. She watched as the world outside woke slowly, the sidewalks filling with people bundled against the cold. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A message from Charles. "I'll take care of it. Just let me know if you change your mind." Amara set the phone down without responding. She didn't doubt his ability to handle things. Charles knew how to wield his influence, how to turn quiet moments of injustice into polished emails and discreet phone calls. But this wasn't about Natalie Harper, or the man at the baggage claim. This was about the accumulation of small stones, the ones Amara had learned to carry because setting them down wasn't always an option. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the bitterness curling across her tongue. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the weight she carried. But Amara knew, and sometimes, knowing was enough. The streets of the city unfolded beneath Amara as she walked, the morning light spilling over storefronts and casting long shadows against the sidewalk. The cold air sharpened her senses, but it did little to quiet the noise in her head, the echo of too many small moments, piling one atop the other, like bricks in a wall she hadn't asked to build. Her destination was simple, a small cafe a few blocks from home, one she frequented when she wanted to disappear into the quiet hum of normalcy. But as Amara approached, she felt the weight of the invisible line that seemed to follow her wherever she went, a line that wasn't drawn in chalk or paint, but in the thin, shifting glances of strangers who saw her without really seeing her at all. Inside, the cafe was warm, filled with the smell of roasted coffee and fresh bread. The low murmur of conversation hummed beneath the soft jazz playing overhead. Amara found a table near the window, pulling out a book she had brought with her. But even as she opened it, her attention drifted. Near the counter, a small group of women stood in quiet conversation, their laughter soft but pointed. One of them, a tall, pale woman with silver hair and a leather purse tucked neatly under her arm, glanced in Amara's direction. It was the kind of glance Amara recognized immediately. Not overtly hostile, not cruel, just calculating. Amara turned her eyes to the page in front of her. Though she hadn't read a word, the woman's voice carried easily across the room, though her words were spoken just low enough to feign innocence. "I'm just saying," she murmured. "These neighborhoods, they're not the same anymore." One of the other women hummed in agreement, stirring her coffee with deliberate slowness. Amara felt the sharp edge of those words, as if they had been spoken directly to her, though the women never looked her way again. This, too, was part of the dance. The art of being dismissed without acknowledgement. The quiet, skillful way people could carve out space that excluded you, without ever having to say your name. Amara closed the book softly, resting her hands on the cover as she watched the women leave, their conversation trailing behind them like perfume. She thought about how long she had been hearing that particular tune, the melody shifting but never truly changing. Later that day, Amara found herself downtown, weaving through the crowd as she made her way toward the gallery where Charles was hosting a corporate event. The building loomed tall and sleek, its glass facade reflecting the bright afternoon sky. Inside, everything was polished, the walls lined with modern art, the lighting soft but precise. Charles stood near the entrance, his presence commanding yet effortless. He wore power the way some men wore their coats comfortably, as if it had been tailored to fit him alone. When he saw Amara, his face lit up in that quiet way it always did. "Glad you made it," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. She smiled, but the lingering weight of the cafe still clung to her, as Charles turned to introduce her to a small circle of colleagues. Amara felt the shift almost immediately. The men shook her hand firmly, with the kind of respect they reserved for people adjacent to power. But the women, their greetings were softer, more fleeting. There was politeness, yes, but beneath it, there was something else, something that flickered briefly in their eyes before they smiled and turned away. Amara had seen it before, countless times. She was Charles's wife, a fact that afforded her access to spaces not typically offered to women who looked like her. But access, she had learned, was not the same as belonging. In the far corner of the gallery, Amara caught sight of Natalie Harper. For a moment, she thought she was mistaken. But no, there Natalie stood, carefully arranging a small display table. Amara's chest tightened, though she wasn't sure why. Natalie looked up briefly, her eyes catching Amara's across the room. There was no sign of recognition, no acknowledgement of their previous encounter. Amara wasn't surprised. She had been erased before. As the evening stretched on, Amara drifted to the edges of the room, watching as Charles navigated the crowd with practiced ease. Natalie, meanwhile, moved quietly, arranging plates and ensuring the staff worked efficiently. It wasn't until Amara stepped toward the refreshment table that their paths crossed directly. Natalie glanced up, her eyes flicking to Amara for only a moment before she turned away. "Mrs. Delaney," Natalie said, her tone neutral, professional. "Is there something I can get for you?" Amara studied her for a long moment, letting the weight of the silence stretch between them. "No," Amara replied softly, but with a firmness that made Natalie glance up again. "I just wanted to say I remember you." Natalie's eyes shifted, the mask slipping ever so slightly. "I don't think we've met before," Natalie said, though Amara could see the faint ripple of discomfort behind her eyes. Amara smiled faintly, shaking her head. "No," she said, "I suppose we haven't." She let the words hang there, waiting for them to settle in the space between them. Natalie's posture shifted, and for a brief second, Amara thought she saw something else in the woman's eyes, something that looked a little like shame. But shame, Amara had learned, was a fleeting guest. As Amara walked away, she could feel Natalie's gaze lingering on her back, the shape of their unspoken history stretching between them like a thread too thin to break. In another life, Amara might have let the moment pass. But not this time. The next stone, she decided, she would not carry. The soft chatter of the gallery faded as Amara stepped into the cool night air. The city stretched before her, its lights bleeding into the sky. But she wasn't ready to return home just yet. Charles had lingered behind, still locked in conversation with executives who always seemed to need one more word. One more reassurance. That was his world. The world of men who could bend the rules without breaking them, men who, by virtue of their wealth and status, had learned how to make discomfort a tool instead of a burden. But Amara's world did not grant her the same privileges. She walked slowly down the block, past the glass storefronts that glittered beneath the streetlights, each window reflecting a version of herself back at her, tall, poised, but undeniably apart from the world she moved through. Her reflection was disrupted by the shadow of another woman approaching from the opposite direction. Amara slowed when she recognized her. Natalie Harper. The coincidence was almost too perfect, as if the universe itself had decided there were still things left unsaid between them. Natalie hadn't yet noticed Amara. Her eyes focused downward, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. There was no trace of the sharp-edged flight attendant Amara remembered, just a woman. Off the clock, small beneath the towering buildings around her. Amara could have kept walking. She could have let Natalie pass by. Just another stranger on the street. But that wasn't how this story needed to end. "Ms. Harper." Natalie's head snapped up, her steps faltering as her eyes locked onto Amara. For a brief second, there was a flash of something: surprise. Perhaps even irritation, but it was quickly masked by the same professional calm she had worn on the flight. "Mrs. Delaney," Natalie said, her tone neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here." Amara gave a small nod, stepping forward slowly, as if testing the weight of the space between them. "I suppose I didn't expect to see you either," she replied, her voice even but not unkind. "Funny how the world works, isn't it?" Natalie shifted her weight, glancing briefly toward the street as if considering whether to cut the conversation short. But she stayed. "I wasn't sure you remembered me," Amara continued. Natalie's eyes flicked back to her, guarded now. "I didn't think our interaction was memorable." Amara let the words settle, taking note of how carefully they had been chosen. "Maybe not to you," she said quietly, "but that's the difference between us, isn't it?" Natalie's gaze hardened, but Amara wasn't interested in confrontation, not tonight. "You don't have to explain," Amara said, raising a hand gently as if to ease the tension she could feel building between them. "I understand more than you think. People often assume things about others. It's easier that way, faster." Natalie opened her mouth as if to protest, but Amara's soft expression stopped her. Listen, Amara continued, I didn't stop you to demand an apology. I don't need one. I've lived long enough to know what that sounds like. And I've also learned how little it really changes. Natalie's shoulders relaxed, but she still looked unsure of where this was going. Amara stepped closer, her voice lowering slightly. I only stopped you because I thought you might want to know something. Natalie tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. I wasn't always married to Charles, Amara said, her tone calm but pointed. Before him, I was a girl from Harlem. I used to wait tables, worked long shifts behind counters. I know what it feels like to serve people who believe they're better than you. Natalie's expression shifted, her face softening just enough for Amara to see the woman beneath the uniform, the one who had likely worn that same feeling more times than she could count. Amara smiled faintly, but there was no triumph in it. The thing is, she added, even now, I still find myself on the other side of that line. And no matter how much money my husband makes, or how many rooms I walk into with him, there's always someone who looks at me the way you did on that plane. Natalie exhaled slowly, the tension in her posture unwinding like thread pulled too tight for too long. I never meant to. I know, Amara interrupted gently. You didn't mean to. That's the part that's hardest to swallow. The two women stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the city swirling around them, as if the world had no interest in their quiet reckoning. Natalie looked away, her eyes tracing the patterns of light spilling onto the pavement. I guess I don't think about it much, she admitted. You do something for long enough, it becomes routine. Routine, Amara echoed softly. Yes, I suppose that's how it starts. Natalie glanced back at her, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Amara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a card, pressing it into Natalie's hand before she could think to refuse. I'm not asking for anything, Amara said, but if you ever want to talk, really talk, you'll know where to find me. Natalie stared at the card for a long moment, as if unsure what to make of it. Finally, she tucked it into her pocket, her eyes meeting Amara's with something that resembled gratitude, though it was too faint to name outright. Thank you, Natalie said, her voice quiet but sincere. Amara gave a small nod, stepping back as the world folded itself around them once more. Good night, Ms. Harper, she said. Natalie hesitated for a beat before replying. Good night, Mrs. Delaney. As Amara walked away, she felt lighter, not because the burden had disappeared, but because she had chosen not to carry it alone. The next morning unfolded slowly, the sun stretching its way across the skyline as Amara sat by the window, cradling a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't told Charles about Natalie Harper, not yet. It wasn't that she intended to keep it from him, but some conversations needed to settle, like silt drifting to the bottom of a river, before they could be spoken aloud. Instead, Amara let the quiet of the morning hold her. But quiet, as Amara well knew, was a fragile thing. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through the stillness. She placed the cup down and rose, smoothing the front of her cardigan as if to prepare for whatever waited on the other side. When she opened the door, she found Margaret Cole, one of Charles's oldest friends and, more importantly, one of the few women in their circle who seemed to regard Amara not as an extension of Charles, but as a force in her own right. Margaret's face, however, carried the weight of someone who had come with news she'd rather not deliver. Morning, Amara. Mind if I come in? Amara stepped aside, gesturing for Margaret to enter. As they settled into the living room, Margaret wasted little time. I ran into someone at the gallery last night, Margaret began, crossing one leg over the other. Natalie Harper, flight attendant for Horizon. Amara's posture remained still, but inside, something tightened. I wasn't aware she attended, Amara said carefully. Margaret gave a knowing smile. She didn't. She was part of the event staff. Seems she's trying to transition out of flight work. Amara nodded, though she could feel Margaret's eyes lingering on her, searching for something unspoken. She mentioned you, Margaret added after a pause. At that, Amara's gaze lifted. She said she ran into you after the event. Told me she wasn't sure why, but the encounter stayed with her. Amara leaned back slightly, folding her hands in her lap. I suppose some moments refuse to be forgotten, she replied softly. Margaret studied her for a moment longer before exhaling, leaning forward. I know how these things go, Amara, and I know how patient you are with people like Natalie. But I've been around long enough to see how easily patience can turn into silence. Amara's eyes met Margaret's, and for a long moment, nothing passed between them but understanding. Margaret shifted, resting her elbow on the armrest as she lowered her voice. Charles makes things easier. I know, but he can't fix this for you. Amara smiled faintly. I'm not asking him to. Margaret nodded approvingly. Good, because this isn't his to carry. The words settled heavily in the room. But Amara didn't shy away from them. She had long since accepted that there were burdens Charles, for all his influence, could never shoulder for her. Later that afternoon, Amara found herself at a corner cafe she hadn't visited in years. It was a modest place, tucked between old brick buildings, with windows that fogged from the warmth of fresh bread and hot coffee. She chose a seat near the back, away from the bustle of the counter, and let the low hum of conversation wash over her. She hadn't been sitting long when the door opened, and Natalie Harper stepped inside. Amara watched as Natalie ordered a coffee, her posture slightly stiffer than it had been the night before, as if the weight of their conversation still clung to her. When Natalie turned, their eyes met across the cafe. For a second, Natalie hesitated, as if unsure whether to approach. But Amara offered a small nod, and Natalie crossed the room, settling into the seat across from her. Neither of them spoke at first. The air between them felt thin, stretched taut by all that remained unspoken. I wasn't expecting to see you here, Natalie said finally, breaking the silence. Amara traced the rim of her cup with one finger, her eyes calm but focused. I wasn't expecting you to remember me, Amara replied. Natalie exhaled softly, wrapping her hands around her mug. I thought about what you said, Natalie admitted, her gaze fixed on the table. I guess I realized, I've spent a lot of years moving too fast. It's easy to make assumptions when you don't stop long enough to see people clearly. Amara's expression softened, but she didn't rush to comfort Natalie. Growth, she knew, often came at the cost of discomfort. I know what that feels like, Amara said, but knowing it doesn't make it right. Natalie nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. I don't want to be that kind of person, she said quietly. Amara studied her carefully. And what kind of person do you want to be? Natalie looked up then, and in her eyes, Amara saw something shift, something small, but real. The kind who listens, Natalie answered, the kind who doesn't forget people like you. Amara smiled faintly, though there was no triumph in it, only the quiet understanding of someone who had walked this path before. That's a good place to start, Amara said, lifting her cup. Natalie mirrored the gesture, and for the first time since their paths had crossed, they sat not as adversaries, but as two women separated by experience, but perhaps not as far apart as they once believed. And in the distance between them, something fragile but steady began to take root. Amara had long believed that the heaviest burdens were not the grand, sweeping injustices those were too loud to ignore, too large to slip past the senses. No, the weight that lingered, that burrowed into the chest and stayed, was the quiet accumulation of small things. A glance too long, a smile too thin, a name mispronounced, or worse, forgotten. It was in these moments, almost invisible to the untrained eye, that the heart learned how to bear an ache without ever speaking it aloud. The afternoon sun filtered through the cafe window, catching the steam that rose from Amara's tea. Across from her, Natalie Harper sat with her shoulders drawn tight, as if the simple act of sitting across from Amara required more effort than she was willing to admit. Amara had seen that posture before, the posture of someone learning, but not yet ready to claim their learning aloud. I've been thinking about what you said, Natalie began, her voice hesitant, like someone walking carefully across ice. Amara waited. She had learned the importance of silence, the way it created space for others to fill with their truths, however uncomfortable they might be. Natalie's fingers drummed lightly against her cup. She wasn't looking at Amara. Not directly. Her eyes traced the patterns on the table instead. I don't think I ever stopped to wonder why I treated people differently, Natalie continued, her words measured. It wasn't conscious. Not really. I just moved through the world the way I was taught to. Amara tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. And how were you taught? Natalie exhaled, finally lifting her eyes to meet Amara's. To be polite, to smile, but never too much, and to watch, to read people. Amara set her cup down gently. And what did you see when you looked at me? Natalie opened her mouth, but the words caught somewhere between her throat and her pride. She looked away again. I thought you were ordinary. Natalie admitted, barely above a whisper. Amara smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the kind of smile that carried the weight of too many years spent being mistaken for less than she was. I am ordinary, Amara said, but I wonder. Natalie, would I have seemed ordinary if I looked different? If I dressed differently? Natalie's shoulders sank, as if the question itself had pierced something she wasn't ready to face. I don't know, she replied honestly. And that, Amara thought, was the first honest thing Natalie had said since she sat down. They left the cafe together. The afternoon air crisp against their skin. The city stretched wide around them, full of people moving in ways that suggested nothing in the world had ever tried to slow them down. Natalie walked beside Amara, her hands buried in the pockets of her coat. She seemed smaller now, as if the weight of their conversation had stripped something from her, a layer of certainty she hadn't realized she was wearing. I need to ask you something, Natalie said as they approached the corner. Amara glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. Go ahead. Natalie hesitated, but only briefly. Do you think I'm one of those people? She asked. The kind that makes things harder for women like you? The question hung there, suspended between them like a wire stretched thin. Amara stopped walking. She turned to face Natalie fully, searching her expression for the thing Natalie wasn't brave enough to say out loud. I think, Amara said slowly, you've been part of something larger than yourself. And I think you never questioned it because you never had to. Natalie nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. Amara softened. But I also think, she added, that people like you have a choice. You can look away, or you can stay in the discomfort long enough to change what you see. Natalie met Amara's gaze, and for the first time, Amara saw something there that hadn't been present before: an opening. A crack in the foundation of everything Natalie thought she knew. Staying in it isn't easy, Natalie admitted. No, Amara replied, it isn't, but the truth rarely is. That evening, as Amara returned home, the quiet felt heavier than usual. Charles was waiting for her in the living room, his eyes soft but curious as she hung her coat by the door. You were gone longer than I expected, he remarked, his voice laced with unspoken questions. Amara smiled, settling beside him on the couch. I ran into Natalie Harper. Charles's eyebrows lifted slightly. The flight attendant? Amara nodded, folding her hands in her lap. We talked, she said simply. Charles leaned back, studying her carefully. Did she apologize? Amara exhaled softly, the ghost of a smile playing at the corner of her lips. Not directly, she replied, but I don't think she's ready for that yet. Charles frowned slightly, his fingers tracing patterns along the arm of the couch. And you're all right with that? Amara looked at him, and in her gaze was the quiet understanding of someone who had carried the weight of many things, too many things, for far too long. Apologies aren't always the point, Charles, she said gently. Sometimes, it's enough to know that someone has started to see the world differently. Even if just for a moment. Charles wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. You're more patient than I am, he muttered. Amara chuckled softly, resting her head against his shoulder. No, she whispered, I've just been doing this longer. As the evening stretched on, Amara closed her eyes, allowing herself the small comfort of knowing that change, however slow, had begun. It wasn't victory, but it was something, and sometimes, something was enough. The weeks that followed drifted by quietly. But Amara knew better than to mistake quiet for peace. There were no sudden revelations, no grand moments of reckoning. Change, as Amara had learned, rarely arrived with fanfare. It crept in slowly, slipping through the cracks of old habits, whispering its presence in the stillness between conversations. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, with the rain pressing lightly against the windowpane, that the phone rang. Amara had been reading, but her eyes lifted as the sound echoed through the house. She let it ring twice before answering. Amara Delaney speaking. A pause too brief for most to notice. But Amara caught it. Mrs. Delaney, this is Natalie Harper. Amara set the book aside, sitting up just a little straighter. Hello, Natalie. I hope I'm not interrupting, Natalie said, her voice measured, but not quite steady. I wasn't sure if I should call. Amara glanced out the window, watching the way the rain softened the edges of the street below. You wouldn't be calling if you weren't sure, Amara replied gently. A soft exhale drifted through the line. I suppose not, Natalie admitted. I wanted to thank you for the other night, She hesitated. For not walking away when you could have. Amara smiled faintly, though Natalie couldn't see it. I didn't stay for your sake. Natalie, Amara said. I stayed because silence has a price. And I've paid it too many times already. Natalie's voice was softer now, as if the weight of Amara's words pressed against her. I know I can't undo how I've acted. Natalie began carefully. But I want to do better. I don't know if that matters. It matters, Amara said, but not to me. It matters to the next woman who sits in your row. The one you haven't met yet. Natalie was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. I don't think I realized how easy it was to hurt someone. She said, the admission trembling just beneath her breath. Amara's gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. It's always been easy, Natalie, but the hard part, the part that lasts, is deciding not to. A week later, Amara found herself at the airport once again. She moved through the terminal with practiced ease, the heels of her shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. It wasn't long before she reached her gate. The waiting area was crowded, filled with the quiet urgency of people eager to leave but resigned to wait. Amara took a seat near the window, watching as the plane she would soon board taxied to the gate. It wasn't until she heard footsteps approaching that she looked up. Natalie Harper stood before her, dressed in the same crisp uniform Amara remembered. But there was something different in her posture, something softer, less rehearsed. Mrs. Delaney, Natalie said, offering a small but genuine smile. Natalie, Amara replied, returning the smile with a quiet nod. Natalie shifted slightly, clasping her hands in front of her. I just wanted to let you know, Natalie said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had rehearsed this moment, that I spoke to the crew before this flight. I told them to remember that not everyone who sits in their section will demand their attention. But that doesn't mean they don't deserve it. Amara studied her for a moment, letting the words settle between them. That's a good start, Amara said. Natalie's smile grew just a little. I'll see you on board, Natalie added before turning and walking back toward the gate. As Amara watched her go, she felt something shift, not the world itself, but the air around her. The weight she had carried for so long hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter, as if someone else had reached out to hold it for just a little while. And maybe, Amara thought, that was enough. For now.